August 27th, 1943. A freight train rolls through the Kansas prairie under a sky so wide it seems to swallow the horizon. Inside a converted boxcar, 43 German prisoners of war sit in silence, their uniforms still stiff with salt from the Atlantic crossing. Among them is a 24-year-old corporal named Karl, formerly of the 7th Panzer Division, captured 3 months earlier during the Allied invasion of Sicily. He has not eaten a proper meal in 6 days. His stomach cramps with hunger. His lips are cracked from dehydration. He expects nothing from America except what the Reich told him to expect. A nation of mongrels and weaklings who would rather see their enemies starve than waste good food on prisoners. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The train stops at a small station outside a town called Concordia. Guards open the boxcar doors. Sunlight floods in, blinding after hours of darkness. Karl shields his eyes and steps onto the platform, his legs unsteady. The heat is suffocating, different from the dry heat of North Africa, thick and humid, pressing against his skin like a wet towel. An American sergeant, heavy-set with a face burned red by the sun, motions for the prisoners to form a line. They obey. They have no choice. They are marched down a dirt road, flanked by fields of something Karl does not immediately recognize. Tall green stalks, taller than a man, stretching in rows that seem endless. The leaves rustle in the wind. The sound is almost musical. He has never seen anything like it. They arrive at Camp Concordia, a sprawling compound of wooden barracks surrounded by chain-link fencing and watchtowers. The gate swings open. Karl and the others are processed, fingerprinted, photographed, assigned barracks and bunk numbers. Then they are led to a mess hall, a long wooden building, with rows of tables and benches. The smell hits Karl before he sees the food. Something rich, something buttery, something entirely foreign. The prisoners sit. American cooks, civilian men too old for combat, carry trays to each table. On Karl's tray, a piece of grilled meat, pale and unmarked by bones. A mound of white beans swimming in brown sauce. A slice of bread, thick and golden. And something else. Something that makes Karl stare. A yellow cob, as long as his forearm, studded with kernels of corn, glistening with melted butter and dusted with salt. It sits on his tray, like an artifact from another world. Karl has seen corn before, of course, but only as animal feed, dried and ground into meal for livestock. He has never seen it prepared whole, never imagined it could be eaten this way. He watches the American cook place another cob on the next prisoner's tray, then another, moving down the line with casual efficiency. The other prisoners stare too. Some whisper. One laughs nervously. An older man, a sergeant named Otto Voss, picked up the cob with his fingers, examining it as if it might explode. He turns to Karl and says in German, "What is this? Do they expect us to eat like pigs?" Karl does not answer. He is too busy watching an American guard sitting at a nearby table. The guard, a young man no older than Karl himself, picks up his own corn cob with both hands, brings it to his mouth, and bites directly into the kernels. He chews. He grins. He takes another bite, rotating the cob as he eats, butter dripping onto his fingers. He licks his fingers clean, and reaches for a napkin. The motion is so natural, so unconscious, that Karl realizes this is not a joke. This is not a test. Americans actually eat corn this way. They eat it with their hands, they bite into it like wolves tearing into meat, and they seem to enjoy it. Karl picks up the cob. It is still warm. The butter has pooled in the grooves between the kernels. He brings it to his nose and inhales. The smell is sweet, earthy, faintly smoky. His stomach growls. He glances at Otto, who is still staring at his own cob with suspicion. Karl makes a decision. He bites into the corn. The kernels burst against his teeth, releasing a flood of sweetness and salt. The texture is strange, both firm and yielding, the juice running down his chin. He chews. He swallows. He takes another bite, and another. Within seconds, the cob is half gone. He cannot stop. He has not tasted anything this good in months, maybe years. The butter coats his tongue. The salt makes him crave more. He finishes the cob, sets it down on his tray, and stares at the bare core, unable to believe what he has just done. Around him, the other prisoners are eating too. Some hesitantly, others with the same desperate hunger Karl feels. Otto finally bites into his corn, grimaces at first, then keeps eating. A young private named Asef Keller devours his in under a minute and looks around for more. The mess hall fills with the sound of chewing, the scrape of forks against tin trays, the low murmur of German voices trying to make sense of what is happening. One man says, "If they feed us like this, maybe the Americans are not as weak as we thought." Another replies, "Or maybe they want to fatten us up before they kill us." But Karl does not believe that. He has seen the guard's face, the ease with which the man ate his corn. There was no malice there. No cruelty. Just a man eating his dinner. That night, lying on his bunk in the barracks, Karl cannot sleep. His mind replays the moment over and over, the sweetness of the corn, the casualness of the guard, the absurdity of biting into food with his bare hands in front of strangers. In Germany, such a thing would have been considered barbaric, the behavior of peasants or animals. Even during the war, even when rations were scarce, German soldiers ate with utensils, maintained discipline, preserved dignity. But here, in America, dignity seemed to mean something different. It was not about formality, it was about abundance. About having so much food that you could afford to eat it with your hands, to let butter drip onto your fingers, to laugh and talk while you chewed. Karl realizes something that unsettles him deeply. He has been taught his entire life that Germans were superior, that their culture was more refined, their discipline unmatched. But if that were true, why were the Americans eating better than he ever had? Why did they have corn to waste on prisoners, while German civilians back home were rationing bread? The transformation did not happen all at once. It happened in small moments, small observations that accumulated over weeks and months until the weight of them became impossible to ignore. Karl Brenner had been a soldier for 3 years before his capture. He had joined the Wehrmacht in 1940, full of pride and certainty, believing in the righteousness of the Reich and the inevitability of German victory. He had fought in Poland, in France, in North Africa. He had seen men die. He had killed men himself, though he tried not to think about their faces. He had done his duty, and he had expected to continue doing it until the war was won.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
But now, sitting in a prison camp in Kansas, eating corn on the cob for the 3rd time in as many days, he was beginning to doubt everything he had been told. Camp Concordia held over 2,000 German prisoners by the end of 1943. It was one of dozens of camps scattered across the American Midwest, each one designed to hold enemy soldiers far from the coasts, far from any possibility of escape or sabotage. The camp itself was not luxurious, but neither was it the hellhole Karl had been prepared for. The barracks were wooden and drafty, but they had roofs and floors. The bunks had mattresses, thin but sufficient. There were showers with hot water, a luxury Karl had not experienced since before the war. There was an infirmary staffed by American medics who treated prisoners with the same care they would give their own soldiers. There was even a library, a small collection of books in German and English, donated by local churches and aid organizations. But it was the food that continued to astonish Karl. Every meal included corn in some form. Corn on the cob at dinner, corn bread at breakfast, corn chowder at lunch, corn mixed into stews, baked into casseroles, served as a side dish alongside meat and potatoes. The Americans seemed to have an endless supply of it, and they served it without hesitation, without resentment, as if feeding enemy soldiers were the most natural thing in the world. Karl tried to understand the logic. Perhaps corn was cheap in America, so cheap that even prisoners could be given as much as they wanted. Perhaps it was a propaganda tactic, a way to demoralize German soldiers by showing them how abundant American resources were. But if it was propaganda, it was working. Because every time Karl bit into a cob of corn, every time he tasted the sweetness and felt the butter coat his tongue, he was forced to confront the reality that America was not collapsing. It was thriving. One afternoon in September, Karl was assigned to a work detail outside the camp. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners of war to work, provided the work was not directly related to the war effort and the prisoners were paid for their labor. Most of the men in Camp Concordia worked on local farms, harvesting crops to replace the American laborers who had enlisted or moved to factory jobs. Karl's detail was sent to a farm owned by a man named Harold Mitchell, a weathered 50-year-old with calloused hands and a quiet demeanor. Mitchell grew corn, acres and acres of it, and he needed help bringing in the harvest before the first frost. Karl and 15 other prisoners were loaded onto a truck and driven 10 miles into the countryside. The guards who accompanied them were older men, veterans of the First War, armed but not aggressive. They seemed more interested in smoking cigarettes and swapping stories than in watching the prisoners closely. The work was backbreaking. Karl spent 8 hours a day pulling ears of corn from the stalks, tossing them into wagons, hauling the wagons to a barn where the corn was sorted and stored. His hands blistered, his back ached. The sun beat down on him relentlessly. But there was something satisfying about the work, something honest. He was not fighting, he was not killing, he was simply harvesting food. At midday, Mitchell's wife, a stout woman named Margaret, brought lunch to the fields. She set up a folding table under the shade of a tree and laid out sandwiches, apples, and a jug of cold water. The guards ate first, then the prisoners. Karl sat on the ground, his back against a wagon wheel, and ate a sandwich made of ham and cheese on thick white bread. Margaret approached him with a basket of corn cobs, freshly boiled and slathered with butter. She held the basket out to him and said in slow, careful English, "You like corn, yes?" Karl nodded. He took a cob from the basket and bit into it. The sweetness exploded in his mouth. He looked up at Margaret, and for a moment, their eyes met. She was not afraid of him. She was not angry. She was simply a woman offering food to a hungry man. She smiled, a small tired smile, and moved on to the next prisoner. Karl watched her go, and something inside him cracked. He had been taught that Americans were his enemies, that they were lesser, that they deserved to be conquered, but Margaret Mitchell did not seem like an enemy. She seemed like someone's mother, someone's wife, someone who had probably sent her own sons off to war, and who now inexplicably was feeding the men those sons were fighting against. That evening, back at the camp, Karl sat on his bunk and wrote a letter to his mother in Munich. The letter would be censored by American authorities before it was sent, so he was careful with his words. He did not mention the corn specifically, did not describe the meals or the abundance. Instead, he wrote about the weather, about the flatness of Kansas, about the kindness of the guards. He wrote that he was safe, that he was being treated well, that she should not worry, but between the lines, he wanted to say something else. He wanted to say that he was confused, that the world he had believed in was not the world he was experiencing, that the Americans were not monsters, and that maybe, just maybe, the Reich had lied to him. He could not write those words. The censors would strike them out, or worse, he would be punished for defeatism. So he folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and handed it to the camp clerk. He did not know if it would ever reach his mother. The mail from Germany had stopped coming months ago. He did not know if she was even alive. Weeks turned into months, the harvest ended, and the prisoners were assigned new work details. Karl was sent to a construction crew building a new road outside the town of Belleville, The work was grueling, digging trenches, laying gravel, pouring concrete, but it kept him busy, kept his mind from wandering too far into dangerous territory. The guards on the construction detail were more relaxed than the ones at the camp. They joked with the prisoners, shared cigarettes, even played cards during breaks. One guard, a man named Ray Tucker, had a son fighting in Italy. Tucker showed Karl a photograph of the boy, a skinny kid with a lopsided grin, standing in front of a tank. Tucker said, "He's over there shooting at your buddies, and here I am making sure you don't run off. Funny how things work out, huh?" Karl did not know what to say. He looked at the photograph, and saw not an enemy, but a boy who looked like 100 boys he had known in Germany, boys who had joined the Hitler Youth, boys who had believed in the Führer, boys who were now dead or captured or broken. He handed the photograph back to Tucker, and said in halting English, "I hope he comes home safe." Tucker stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Me too." In November, the camp held a Thanksgiving celebration. The prisoners did not understand the holiday, but the Americans explained it was a day of gratitude, a day to give thanks for the harvest, and for blessings. The mess hall was decorated with paper turkeys and autumn leaves. The cooks prepared a feast: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, and of course corn, mountains of corn, served every possible way. Corn on the cob, creamed corn, corn pudding, corn fritters. The prisoners ate until they could not eat any more. Otto Voss, who had been so suspicious of the corn back in August, now ate 3 cobs without hesitation. He leaned over to Karl and said, "If this is how the Americans treat their prisoners, imagine how they treat their own people. We never had a chance." Karl thought about that statement for days. He thought about the propaganda he had been fed, the speeches about American decadence and weakness. He thought about the newsreels, showing bombed-out American cities, starving American children, a nation on the verge of collapse. None of it had been true. The Americans were not weak, they were not starving, they had so much food they could afford to feed their enemies 3 meals a day, with corn at every meal, and still have enough left over to send supplies to their soldiers overseas. The scale of American abundance was incomprehensible. It defied everything Karl had been taught, and it made him question not just the war, but the ideology that had started it. By December, Karl had been in Camp Concordia for 4 months. He had gained weight. His clothes, which had hung loose on his frame when he arrived, now fit properly. His skin had lost the sickly gray pallor of captivity and malnutrition. He looked healthy, almost normal. But inside, he felt hollowed out. The certainty that had carried him through 3 years of war was gone, replaced by doubt and confusion. He no longer knew who he was. He was not a soldier anymore, not really. Soldiers fought. Soldiers obeyed orders. Soldiers believed in their cause. Karl did none of those things. He was a prisoner, but he was also something else. He was a man beginning to see the world through different eyes, and those eyes were showing him things he could not unsee. One cold evening in mid-December, Karl was walking back to his barracks after dinner when he heard music coming from the recreation hall. He followed the sound and found a group of prisoners gathered around a piano. One of them, a former music teacher named Ludwig Steiner, was playing Christmas carols. The men sang along, their voices blending in harmony, the German words of Stille Nacht filling the room. Karl stood in the doorway and listened. The song was familiar, comforting, a reminder of home, but it also felt distant, like a memory from another life. He thought about his mother, about Christmas Eve in Munich, about the smell of roasted chestnuts and the sound of church bells. He wondered if those things still existed, or if the war had destroyed them too. An American guard stood near the piano, listening to the singing. The guard was young, maybe 20, with red hair and freckles. When the song ended, the guard clapped. The prisoners looked at him, surprised. The guard said, "That was real nice. My grandma used to sing that song." She came from Germany, way back, taught me a few words. He said something in clumsy German, mangling the pronunciation, and the prisoners laughed. Not in mockery, but in genuine amusement. The guard laughed too. For a moment, the war did not exist. There were no sides, no enemies, just men sharing a song on a cold December night. Karl left the recreation hall and walked back to his barracks. The air was freezing, his breath visible in the darkness. He climbed onto his bunk and pulled the blanket over himself. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind would not stop. He kept thinking about the corn, about the butter dripping down his chin, about the absurdity of eating with his hands, about the kindness of strangers who had every reason to hate him. He thought about Margaret Mitchell offering him a basket of corn. He thought about Ray Tucker showing him a photograph of his son. He thought about the guard singing Christmas carols in broken German, and he realized something that terrified him. He did not want to go back to Germany, not because he was a traitor, not because he had betrayed his country, but because Germany, the Germany he had known, no longer existed, and the America he had feared, the America he had been told to despise, was showing him a future he had never imagined. A future where enemies could become something else. Where corn was not just animal feed, but a symbol of abundance, of generosity, of a nation that had so much it could afford to share even with those who sought to destroy it. Karl Brenner did not know it yet, but that realization would shape the rest of his life. It would lead him down a path he could not have predicted, a path that would take him far from the barracks of Camp Concordia and into a future he could not yet imagine. But for now, in the winter of 1943, he was simply a prisoner of war, lying on a bunk in Kansas, thinking about corn. May 8, 1945. The announcement came through the camp loudspeakers just after breakfast. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Adolf Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen to the Soviets. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, had collapsed in 12. Karl Brenner stood in the yard of Camp Concordia, surrounded by 2,000 German prisoners, and felt nothing, not relief, not grief, not shock, just emptiness. Around him, men reacted in different ways. Some wept openly, their faces buried in their hands. Others stood rigid, refusing to believe it. A few shouted that it was Allied propaganda, that the Führer would never surrender, that the war would continue. But most, like Karl, simply stood in silence, trying to comprehend what this meant for them. The camp commander, Colonel James Hartwell, addressed the prisoners that afternoon. He stood on a wooden platform, flanked by guards, and spoke through a translator. He told them the war was over. He told them they would be repatriated to Germany as soon as transportation could be arranged. He told them they had fought honorably, that they would be treated with dignity during the transition, and that they should cooperate fully with the process. Then he said something that stuck with Karl for the rest of his life. He said, "You are no longer our enemies. You are simply men trying to go home. We will help you get there." The translator repeated the words in German. Several prisoners broke down, others stared at their boots. Karl felt a knot tighten in his chest. Home, where was home? Munich was likely rubble. His mother, if she had survived the bombing, was living under Allied occupation. His father had died in 1941, on the Eastern Front. His younger brother had been conscripted in 1944, and Karl had no idea if he was alive or dead. What was he going home to? Over the following weeks, letters began arriving from Germany. The mail system, which had been severed for months, slowly resumed. Karl received a letter from his mother. The envelope was stained and crumpled, the handwriting shaky. She was alive. She was living with his aunt, in a village outside Munich. The city was destroyed. Food was scarce. The Americans and British controlled the western zones. The Soviets controlled the east. She asked if he was safe. She asked when he would come home. She did not ask about the war. She did not mention Hitler. She simply wanted her son back. Karl read the letter 3 times, then folded it and put it in his pocket. He should have felt relief. He should have felt joy. Instead, he felt dread. The repatriation process began in June. Prisoners were processed in groups, transported by train to East Coast ports, then loaded onto ships bound for Europe. The camp population began to shrink. Barracks that had been full now stood half empty. Men who had spent years together said their goodbyes, exchanged addresses, promised to write. Most knew they would never see each other again. Karl was assigned to a repatriation group scheduled to depart in late July. He had 6 weeks left in America. He spent those weeks in a strange limbo, no longer a soldier, not yet a free man, caught between two worlds. He continued working on the road construction crew. He continued eating meals in the mess hall. Corn still served at nearly every dinner. He continued writing letters to his mother, assuring her he would be home soon. But at night, lying on his bunk, he allowed himself to think about what he was leaving behind. One afternoon in early July, Karl was working on the road crew when Harold Mitchell drove up in his truck. Mitchell had come to deliver supplies to the construction site, sacks of gravel and bags of cement. He climbed out of the truck and approached Karl, who was shoveling gravel into a trench. Mitchell said, "Heard you're shipping out soon." Karl nodded. He wiped sweat from his forehead and leaned on his shovel. Mitchell looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to say something but could not find the words. Finally he said, "You're a good worker, Karl. If things were different, I'd hire you on permanent." Karl did not know how to respond. He said, "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. You have been very kind." Mitchell shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Then he reached into his truck and pulled out a burlap sack. He handed it to Karl. "For the trip," he said. "Fresh corn from this morning's harvest. Margaret boiled it for you." Karl took the sack. It was warm, heavy, with at least a dozen ears of corn. He looked at Mitchell, this man who had fed him, who had treated him with respect, who had no reason to show him any kindness. Karl felt his throat tighten. He said, "I do not know what to say." Mitchell shrugged. "Don't say nothing, just eat it." He climbed back into his truck and drove off, leaving Karl standing on the side of the road, holding a sack of corn. That evening, back at the camp, Karl shared the corn with the men in his barracks. They ate it together, sitting on their bunks, butter dripping onto their hands, the sweetness filling their mouths one last time. Otto Voss said, "We will never eat corn like this again. Not in Germany." He was right. July 28, 1945. Karl Brenner stood on the platform at the Concordia train station with 200 other prisoners. They wore their old Wehrmacht uniforms, cleaned and patched. They carried small bags with their belongings, letters, photographs, a few trinkets they had made or been given. Guards lined the platform, but they were not needed. No one was going to run. Where would they go? The train arrived, steam hissing, brakes screeching. The prisoners boarded. Karl found a seat by the window and pressed his face against the glass. The train pulled away from the station. He watched the town of Concordia recede into the distance, the fields of corn stretching to the horizon, the flat Kansas prairie that had been his prison and his refuge for 2 years. He watched until the town disappeared completely. Then he closed his eyes and tried not to think about what lay ahead. The journey back to Germany took 3 weeks. Train to New York, processing at Camp Shanks, a week waiting in a crowded tent city with thousands of other repatriated prisoners. Then a Liberty ship across the Atlantic, the hull packed with men, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and salt water. Karl spent most of the crossing on deck, staring at the ocean, trying to prepare himself for what he would find. When the ship finally docked in Bremerhaven, Karl disembarked and set foot on German soil for the first time in 3 years. The port was in ruins. Buildings stood as hollow shells, their walls blackened by fire. Cranes hung twisted and broken. The streets were filled with rubble. Civilians, gaunt and hollow-eyed, picked through the wreckage, looking for anything salvageable. Karl felt like he had stepped into a nightmare. He made his way to Munich by train, a journey that took 2 days because the rail lines had been bombed and detours were necessary. When he finally arrived, he barely recognized the city. The train station was a skeleton of twisted metal. The streets were canyons of debris. Entire neighborhoods had been erased. He walked through the ruins, asking for directions, until he found his aunt's village on the outskirts. His mother was waiting for him. She had aged a decade in 3 years. Her hair was white, her face was lined with exhaustion, but when she saw Karl she wept. She held him and did not let go for a long time. That night, they sat at a small wooden table in his aunt's kitchen and ate a dinner of watery soup and hard bread. There was no butter, there was no meat, and there was no corn. His mother asked about America. Karl tried to explain what it had been like, the abundance, the food, the kindness of strangers. She listened, but he could see she did not believe him. How could she? She was living in a country where people fought over scraps, where the black market was the only reliable source of food, where Allied soldiers patrolled the streets with rifles. The idea that America had fed its prisoners 3 meals a day, that they had served corn with butter at every dinner, must have sounded like a fairy tale. Karl tried to rebuild his life. He found work as a laborer, clearing rubble, hauling bricks, doing whatever jobs were available. He earned barely enough to survive. He lived with his mother and his aunt in a single room. They slept on thin mattresses on the floor. They washed their clothes in a bucket. They stood in line for rations, bread and potatoes, and occasionally a bit of lard. The contrast between Germany and America was so stark it felt surreal. Karl had spent 2 years in a prison camp, eating better than he now ate as a free man. He had worked on farms that produced more food in a single harvest than Germany seemed capable of growing in a year. He had seen abundance, and now he lived in scarcity. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. By 1947, Karl had made a decision: he could not stay in Germany. There was no future here, only survival. He began researching immigration to the United States. The process was complicated. Former enemy soldiers were not automatically granted visas, but there were pathways. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 allowed certain refugees and former prisoners of war to apply for entry. Karl filled out the paperwork. He wrote letters to the American authorities. He listed his time at Camp Concordia, his work on the Mitchell farm, his clean record. He waited. Months passed. Then in March 1949, he received a letter. His application had been approved. He was granted an immigrant visa to the United States. His mother wept when he told her. She did not want him to leave, but she understood. She said, "Go, build a life. Do not look back." Karl arrived in New York in May 1949. He traveled by train to Kansas. He had written to Harold Mitchell months earlier, asking if there was work available. Mitchell had responded immediately. There was always work on the farm. Karl could start as soon as he arrived. When Karl stepped off the train in Concordia, Mitchell was waiting for him. The 2 men shook hands. Mitchell said, "Welcome back." Karl said, "Thank you for giving me this chance." Mitchell drove him to the farm. Margaret was waiting on the porch. She hugged Karl like he was one of her own sons. That evening they sat down to dinner. On the table, among the roasted chicken and mashed potatoes, was a platter of corn on the cob, glistening with butter. Karl picked up a cob. He brought it to his mouth. He bit into it. The sweetness flooded his senses. He was home. Karl worked on the Mitchell farm for 5 years. He saved his wages. He learned English fluently. He applied for citizenship and was approved in 1954. He became an American. In 1956, he married a woman named Clara Dietrich, the daughter of German immigrants who had come to Kansas in the 1920s. They bought a small house in Concordia. They had 3 children. Karl taught them to speak German, but he also taught them to be American. He taught them about hard work, about gratitude, about the kindness of strangers, and every summer, when the corn was ready for harvest, he took them to the fields and showed them how to pick it. He showed them how to shuck it, how to boil it, how to slather it with butter. He taught them to eat it with their hands, to let the juice run down their chins, to savor every bite. His children did not understand why their father cared so much about corn. To them, it was just food. But to Karl, it was everything. It was the moment he realized the world was not what he had been told. It was the symbol of abundance and generosity. It was the reason he had chosen America over Germany. It was in a strange and unexpected way, the thing that had saved his life. Karl Brenner lived in Concordia until his death in 1998. He worked as a farm manager, raised his children, and became a respected member of the community. He rarely spoke about the war. When people asked, he would say only that he had been a prisoner, that he had been treated well, and that he had decided to stay. He did not talk about the propaganda he had believed, the ideology he had abandoned, or the transformation that had happened slowly over months of eating corn and working alongside Americans. Those were private memories, too complex to explain. But every summer, when the corn was ready, Karl would sit on his porch with his grandchildren and tell them a story. He would tell them about the first time he ate corn on the cob, about how strange it had seemed, how barbaric, and how it had turned out to be one of the best things he had ever tasted. The grandchildren would laugh. They thought it was a funny story. They did not realize it was the story of how their grandfather had become an American. In 2003, a historian named Dr. Ellen Greer published a book titled Prisoners of Plenty, German POWs and the American Midwest. The book included interviews with former prisoners who had returned to the United States after the war. One chapter focused on Karl Brenner. Dr. Greer had interviewed him in 1996, 2 years before his death. In the interview, Karl described his time at Camp Concordia in detail. He talked about the food, the work, the guards, the farmers. He talked about the corn. He said something that Dr. Greer quoted in the book. He said, "I came to America as an enemy. I left as a prisoner, but I returned as a man who understood that the world is more complicated than any ideology can explain. The Americans did not convert me with speeches or propaganda. They converted me with corn, with butter, with kindness, and I will be grateful for that until the day I die." Karl Brenner was not the only German prisoner who never wanted to leave America. Thousands of others made the same choice, drawn back by memories of abundance, by friendships forged during captivity, by the simple recognition that America offered something their devastated homeland could not. They came back legally, through immigration channels, and they built lives. They became farmers, factory workers, teachers, engineers. They married. They raised children. They became Americans. And many of them, like Karl, never forgot the moment that changed everything. The moment they bit into a cob of corn and realized the world was not what they had been told. Today, the site of Camp Concordia is a quiet field on the edge of town. A historical marker stands at the roadside, noting that a prisoner of war camp once stood there. Occasionally, descendants of former prisoners visit. They walk the field. They take photographs. They try to imagine what it was like. In 2019, Karl Brenner's granddaughter Sarah Brenner McLean traveled to Concordia to see the site. She brought with her a small box containing letters her grandfather had written during the war, letters he had never sent, letters he had kept hidden for decades. In one letter, dated December 1943, Karl had written something that Sarah read aloud at the historical marker. He wrote, "I do not know if I will survive this war. I do not know if I will ever see home again. But I know this, I have learned that enemies are not born, they are made. And if they can be made, they can be unmade. All it takes is corn, and butter, and the courage to see another person as human." Sarah stood at the marker and wept. She did not know the full story of her grandfather's transformation. She had only fragments, pieces he had shared over the years. But standing there, in the field where he had once been a prisoner, she understood something essential. War creates enemies. But humanity, simple and persistent, can create something else. It can create understanding. It can create connection. And sometimes, It can create a future where enemies become neighbors, where prisoners become citizens, and where a man who once believed in hate learns to believe in something better. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.